1 Esdras chapter 5. After this, the heads of ancestral houses were chosen to go up, according to their tribes, with their wives and sons and daughters, and their male and female servants, and their livestock. And Darius sent with them 1,000 cavalry to take them back to Jerusalem in safety, with the music of drums and flutes. All their kindred were making merry, and he made them go up with them. These are the names of the men who went up, according to their ancestral houses in the tribes over their groups. The priests, the descendants of Phinehas, son of Aaron. Jeshua, son of Jozadak, son of Sariah, and Joachim, son of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, of the house of David, of the lineage of Phares, of the tribe of Judah, who spoke wise words before King Darius of the Persians in the 2nd year of his reign, in the month of Nisan, the 1st month. These are the Judeans who came up out of their sojourn in exile, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away to Babylon, and who returned to Jerusalem and the rest of Judea, each to his own town. They came with Zerubbabel and Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Resaiah, Ananias, Mordecai, Baal-Saras, Aspar-Asus, Borolias, Rahum, and Baanah, their leaders. The number of those of the nation and their leaders, the descendants of Parosh, 2,172, the descendants of Shephatiah, 472, the descendants of Ara, 756, the descendants of Pahat Moab, of the descendants of Jeshua and Joab, 2,812, the descendants of Elam, 1,254, the descendants of Zatu, 945, the descendants of Korbe, 705, the descendants of Bani, 648, the descendants of Babai, 623, the descendants of Azgad, 1,322, the descendants of Adonikam, 667, the descendants of Bigvai, 2,066, the descendants of Adin, 454, the descendants of Ater, namely Hezekiah, 92, namely of Hezekiah, 92, the descendants of Kelon and Azatus, 67, the descendants of Azaru, 432, the descendants of Anias, 101, the descendants of Arom, the descendants of Bezai, 323, the descendants of Arsi-Purit, 112, the descendants of Baiterus, 3,005, the descendants of Beth-Lomon, 123, those from Netopah, 55, those from Anathoth, 158, those from Bethasmoth, 42, those from Kiriath-Harim, 25, those from Ke-Pira and Beeroth, 743, the Kadiasans and Amidians, 422, those from Kirama and Geba, 621, those from Macalon, 122, those from Betolio, 52, the descendants of Nippich, 156, the descendants of the other Kalamolalus and Ono, 725, the descendants of Jerichus, 345, the descendants of Senah, 3,330, the priests, the descendants of Jediah, son of Jeshua, of the descendants of Anasib, 972, the descendants of Immer, 1,052, the descendants of Pashur, 1,247. The descendants of Carmel, 1,017. The Levites. The descendants of Jeshua and Kadmiel and Banas and Sudias, 74. The temple singers. The descendants of Asaph, 128. The gatekeepers. The descendants of Shalom. The descendants of Ater. The descendants of Talmon. The descendants of Akub. The descendants of Hatita. The descendants of Shobai. In all, 139. The temple servants. The descendants of Esau, the descendants of Hasupah, the descendants of Tabaot, the descendants of Keros, the descendants of Sua, the descendants of Padon, the descendants of Lebanah, the descendants of Hagabah, the descendants of Akub, the descendants of Utai, the descendants of Ketab, the descendants of Hagab, the descendants of Subai, the descendants of Hana, the descendants of Katua, the descendants of Gedur, the descendants of Jairus, the descendants of Disan, the descendants of Noeba, the descendants of Kezib, the descendants of Gezerah, the descendants of Uzzah, the descendants of Phinoe, the descendants of Hasra, the descendants of Bastai, the descendants of Asna, the descendants of Maani, the descendants of Nephisim, the descendants of Akup, the descendants of Hakupa, the descendants of Asur, the descendants of Parakim, the descendants of Bazluth, the descendants of Mehida, the descendants of Kuta, the descendants of Kareah, the descendants of Barkos, the descendants of Serar, the descendants of Tema, the descendants of Neziah, the descendants of Hatipah, the descendants of Solomon's servants, the descendants of Asapaiot, the descendants of Peruda, the descendants of Jala, the descendants of Lazon, the descendants of Isdael, the descendants of Shephatiah, the descendants of Agiah, the descendants of Pokereth Hazebaim, the descendants of Sarotieh, the descendants of Messiah, the descendants of Gas, the descendants of Adus, the descendants of Subas, the descendants of Apera, the descendants of Barudis, the descendants of Shaphat, the descendants of Alon. All the temple servants and the descendants of Solomon's servants were 372. The following are those who came up from Tel Melah and Tel Harsha under the leadership of Kerub, Adon, and Immer, though they could not prove by their ancestral houses or lineage that they belonged to Israel. The descendants of Deliah, son of Tobiah, and the descendants of Nekoda, 652. Of the priests, the following had assumed the priesthood, but were not found registered: the descendants of Habiah, the descendants of Hakos, the descendants of Jadus, who had married Agiah, and the descendants of Jadus, who had married Agiah, one of the daughters of Barzillai, and was called by his name. When a search was made in the register and the genealogy of these men was not found, they were excluded from serving as priests. And Nehemiah and Atarias told them not to share in the holy things until the high priest should appear, wearing Urim and Tumim. All those of Israel, 12 or more years of age, besides male and female servants, were 42,360. Their male and female servants were 7,337. There were 245 musicians and singers. There were 435 camels, 6,036 horses, 245 mules, and 5,525 donkeys. Some of the heads of families, when they came to the temple of God, that is in Jerusalem, vowed that to the best of their ability they would erect the house on its site, and that they would give to the sacred treasury for the work 1,000 minas of gold. 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priests' vestments. The priests, the Levites, and some of the people settled in Jerusalem and its region, and the temple singers, the gatekeepers, and all Israel in their towns. When the 7th month came, and the Israelites were all in their own homes, they gathered with a single purpose in the square before the first gate toward the east. Then Jeshua son of Jozadak with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel with his kinsmen, took their places and prepared the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings upon it in accordance with the directions in the book of Moses, the man of God. And some joined them from the other nations of the land, and they erected the altar in its place. For all the peoples of the land were hostile to them and were stronger than they, and they offered sacrifices at the proper times and burnt offerings to the Lord morning and evening. They kept the festival of booths, as it is commanded in the law, and offered the proper sacrifices every day. And thereafter the regular offerings and sacrifices on Sabbaths and at new moons, and at all the consecrated feasts. And all who had made any vow to God began to offer sacrifices to God from the new moon of the 7th month, though the temple of God was not yet built. They gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food and drink and carts to the Sidonians and the Tyrians to bring cedar logs from Lebanon and convey them in rafts to the harbor of Joppa, according to the decree that they had in writing from King Cyrus of the Persians. In the 2nd year, after their coming to the temple of God in Jerusalem, in the 2nd month, Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel and Jeshua son of Jozadak made a beginning, together with their kindred and the Levitical priests and all who had come back to Jerusalem from exile, and they laid the foundation of the temple of God on the new moon of the 2nd month in the 2nd year after they came to Judea and Jerusalem. They appointed the Levites, who were 20 or more years of age, to have charge of the work of the Lord. And Jeshua arose, and his sons and kindred, and his brother Kadmiel, and the sons of Jeshua Amadabun, and the sons of Joda, son of Eliadun, with their sons and kindred, all the Levites, pressing forward the work of the house of God with a single purpose. So the builders built the temple of the Lord, and the priests stood arrayed in their vestments with musical instruments and trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, praising the Lord and blessing him according to the directions of King David of Israel. They sang hymns, giving thanks to the Lord, for his goodness and his glory are forever upon all Israel. And all the people sounded trumpets and shouted with a great shout, praising the Lord for the erection of the house of the Lord. Some of the Levitical priests and heads of ancestral houses, old men who had seen the former house, came to the building of this one with outcries and loud weeping, while many came with trumpets and a joyful noise, so that the people could not hear the trumpets because of the weeping of the people. For the multitude sounded the trumpets loudly, so that the sound was heard far away. And when the enemies of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin heard it, they came to find out what the sound of the trumpets meant. They learned that those who had returned from exile were building the temple for the Lord God of Israel. So they approached Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the heads of the ancestral houses, and said to them, "We will build with you, for we obey your Lord just as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of King Esarhaddon of the Assyrians, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the heads of the ancestral houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building the house for the Lord our God, for we alone will build it, for the Lord of Israel, as Cyrus, the king of the Persians, has commanded us." But the nations of the land besieged those in Judea, cut off their supplies, and hindered their building. And by plots and demagoguery and uprisings, they prevented the completion of the building as long as King Cyrus lived. They were kept from building for 2 years until the reign of Darius.